I averaged 4,295 steps a day for 13 months, well below the 10,000 you're told you need. And I lost 4.5 stone and 8.5 inches off my waist, not in spite of the low step count, alongside it, which made me look hard at what the 10,000 steps advice is actually based on, and whether the mechanism people think is happening when they walk is the mechanism that's actually doing the work. Dr. von der Wight, orthopaedic surgeon, muscle researcher, she reframed this completely for me. I'm Neil, 13 years off NHS blood tests, off all medication since February 2024. My step count data is logged from Boxing Day 2023 and every single day, including the days I averaged under 3,000. And what the data showed is that the relationship between walking and body composition is a lot more indirect than the 10,000 step message implies. The direct mechanism is insulin and blood sugar, and walking acts on that mechanism, but it's not the most powerful lever that you have access to. Muscle is. In the next 10 minutes, we'll cover 3 things. First, what actually happened to my body composition across 13 months of below recommended step counts, the waist data, the weight data, and what those numbers suggest about which lever was doing the work. Second, the mechanism. Why muscle tissue is the primary glucose sink, and why walking helps your fasting work rather than replacing what the fasting is already doing. And then what changed when I stopped thinking about step counts and started thinking about what movement actually does to blood sugar. Walking matters. It just doesn't work the way most people are told it does. We start with 4,295 steps a day and a belt that stopped fitting. The 10,000 steps guidance has been around so long, it feels like it came from a study. It sounds scientific. It has a number, and the reasoning behind it genuinely makes sense on the surface. More movement means more calorie burned. More calorie burned means fat comes off. Therefore, walk more and lose weight. The NHS promotes it. Every fitness tracker is built around it. GPs mention it in lifestyle conversations. I believed it myself for years. I've got fat around my middle that won't shift no matter what I do. That phrase describes most people who come to this channel, and for a long time I was one of them. I was doing what I was told, walking more, trying to hit the target, tracking the steps, and the weight was going nowhere. I didn't question the target, I questioned myself. Dr. von der Wight, orthopaedic surgeon, spent decades studying what muscle actually does in the body. She put the mechanism plainly. Muscle is a critical vehicle for pulling glucose out of the blood, turning it into the energy our body needs. The more muscle you have, the more efficient you are at doing that, which sounds fine. Except the implication of that is something the 10,000 step message skips entirely. And it's the thing that changed how I think about movement completely. I want to go back to 2023, specifically to the Isle of Wight where I was living before December that year. I was 18 stone, multiple medications, and I was walking, genuinely. I love a walk. I was doing 10,000 steps and more some days. There was a period I was regularly hitting the target, walking the coast paths, getting the fresh air. I went from 18 stone to about 17 stone. And then I stopped losing weight completely. Nothing moved. I was walking 10,000 steps plus per day at the time on average in the summer, eating what I thought was reasonably well, and somewhere in between 17 and 16 stone 9, the scale just sat there for months. There was a practical problem that I didn't talk about much at the time. At 18 stone, chafe was a real issue. 90 minutes of walking at that weight, in that heat, and I was in genuine discomfort. So the idea that I could cheerfully knock out 10,000 steps a day, regardless of the weather or how my body felt, wasn't really the reality, especially when I moved back to Yorkshire. Yorkshire weather made it worse, raining, cold, and already sore. I do very little, average maybe 1,000 steps on those days. On good days, 6,000, maybe more. Boxing Day 2023 to October 2025, average daily step across the entire transformation period, 4,295. That's the number, not 10,000, not even close. And in the Isle of Wight period before that, when I was genuinely trying, genuinely walking, I hit a ceiling I couldn't break. What wasn't changing was the food. What wasn't changing was insulin. I was walking, but I was eating in a way that kept insulin elevated, kept my body locked into fat storage, and walking simply couldn't override that. The steps were happening, the results weren't. Boxing Day 2023, I looked in the mirror and said out loud, this ends now. I didn't start training harder, I didn't set a new step target, I changed what I was eating and when I was eating. 18/6 fasting, which on average was 17/7 in truth. Non-UPF food, kept it simple. I also did a 17-day and a 10-day water fast within the first 6 weeks of that period. The step target went out of the window entirely. My life didn't allow for a 90-minute walk every single day. I was building a business, working long hours, and honestly, I was still physically knackered at the start of this. So I moved when I could, walked when I felt like it. On good days, maybe 6,000 steps. On bad days, under 2,000. On fasting days, well, I've got data that tells a story. My body naturally dropped to around 2,971 steps on average on extended fasting days. Not weakness, conservation. The body was doing something intelligent. What I did do from early 2025, so a year on, was add some short resistance training, short sessions, body weight, then weighted. Not a gym, not a program, just building muscle. Because I'd started to understand about what muscle actually does to blood sugar, and that understanding changed a lot for me. The waist data is where this gets stark. Waist measurement, Boxing Day 2023, 48 inches. Waist measurement, December 2025, 39.5. That's 8.5 inches from 48 to 39.5, just averaging 4,295 steps a day. Below what any tracker would call a success. The weight, 18 stone at the start of that Boxing Day, dropped through 17, 16, 15, and I touched 12 stone, 13, 3/4 at the lowest. That was the lightest I'd been since my early 30s. It's not a coincidence, and it's not a mystery, but it took me a while to understand which lever was actually doing the work. Here's what the step count data alongside the fat loss data is actually showing. The body composition changes weren't driven by the steps. They were driven by what the fasting and the food were doing to insulin. The steps were supporting that process, walking after eating. And there's research from Jessie Inchep on this, biochemist, glucose resolution. She found that when we move after eating, we flatten our glucose curve without increasing our insulin level. The muscles are absorbing glucose directly. That's not nothing, but it's a supporting mechanism, not the primary one. And on one day in 2025, I hit 20,000 steps, not because I set out to, just kept going. Morning walk, afternoon, errands, evening stroll. And I had energy to spare. The capacity to move more had come from losing the weight. The weight loss had not come from moving more. My GP wasn't tracking step counts in the review. She was tracking cholesterol, uric acid, HbA1c, kidney function. The body composition change showed up in the clinical picture. And what she said was, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The steps weren't the story. The story was what was happening to insulin. I'm 53. I was on 6 medications and now I'm on none. I didn't read about this and decide to make videos. I did it, tracked it, got the blood test to prove it, and then made the videos. If you'd rather follow someone with receipts than someone with opinions, subscribe. New video Monday, Wednesday and Friday. What my data suggests, and it's one person's data, 13 months, n equals 1, is that step count was not the primary driver of my body composition change. The primary drivers were fasting and food quality, because those are the things that changed insulin. Movement supported the process. Specifically, walking after eating helped. It helped flatten the blood sugar. Resistance training built muscle, which improved insulin sensitivity over time. But the 10,000 step target on its own, without changing what and when I was eating, produced a plateau that I sat in for months. None of this means walking doesn't matter. It absolutely does. Movement is non-negotiable for long-term health. Cardiovascular function, joint health, mental health, longevity. The guidelines exist for really good reasons. And for people who are not changing anything else, more walking is almost certainly better than less. If your GP has recommended increasing your activity level, that conversation is worth having properly. Not dismissing because of one bloke's step count average. If you're watching your numbers, noticing your belly fat isn't shifting, despite walking regularly, wondering why the effort isn't producing results, this might be worth raising with your GP before the clinical conversation becomes more urgent. The mechanism worth understanding is this. The process that determines whether your body stores or burns fat operates at the hormonal level, and no amount of steps overrides it. If the inputs that drive it haven't changed, that's not about you, that's biology. If you're on medication, if you've got a diagnosed condition, if you're being monitored for anything related to blood sugars or cardiovascular health, your GP is the right person to talk about what movement changes make sense for you. If you want to understand more about what fasting actually does to the mechanism we've talked about today, insulin, blood sugar, why the inputs matter more than the output of a step counter, the 7-day fasting blueprint is in the description, free, download, no catch. And remember, this is educational content. It's not medical advice. I'm not a doctor. Everything I've tracked here is in my own data, and it's been monitored with my GP's results. If you're thinking about changing how you eat, how you fast, or how you move, talk to your GP first. That conversation's the right starting point, always.